One moment so I can screen share. So today I'll be discussing geoengineering, which is a topic that's very future oriented. Can y'all see my screen okay? Okay, good. So this is a very future oriented, oh, forgive me, forgive me. This is a very future oriented discussion and topic because a lot of the topics that we'll be discussing right now, even though climate change is happening right now, most of the major effects of it we are seeing right now, but the technology to combat it, which is the primary discussion here, is very hypothetical, and much of the research concerning this topic has only really occurred in depth and very amplified recently in the past 20 years, really only beginning under much skeptical circumstances in the early 2000s. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and open up. So this is what we'll be discussing today, just a general breakdown, the background and history of geoengineering research, stigmatization and destigmatization of geoengineering, types of engineering, what is geoengineering, as well as ethical concerns and the sociopolitical implications, as well as what comprehensive climate change reform should look like, as well as what this hypothetical could pertain to with regards to geoengineering. So I first want to open up with a land acknowledgement. When we are discussing climate change, when we're talking about a future-oriented methodology, it's also to incorporate our consideration of the past and how we can be very, at times, desensitized to our own past. So with this from the Native Governance Center, it is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. A&M sits on land originally owned by the Tonkawa and Sana tribes. So when we discuss colonialism and imperialism, this manifests itself in climate change and climate change policy as well. So better to be cognizant and reverse our own desensitization to the past in order to approach a more ethical future as well. So first, let's just revisit climate change and what this would look like with regards to geoengineering. Now, we are all familiar with what climate change is. It is the buildup of carbon emissions in the atmosphere that is reflecting back more sunlight and UV rays, but more at a conceptual level concerning the environmental consequences of climate change and the socio-political consequences of climate change. We can discuss declining water supplies, hurricanes becoming stronger and more frequent, as we've seen this year, increasing wildfire, insect outbreaks, and tree diseases, as we've seen in the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast of the United States. Furthermore, you can see global sea level has risen by about 8 inches, according to NASA, since reliable record keeping began in the 1980s. It is, well, with regards to increases in sea levels, it is projected to rise about another 1 to 8 feet by 2100. This is the result of added water from melting land ice and expansion of seawater as it warms. In the next several decades, storm surges and high tides could combine with sea level rise and land subsidence to further increase flooding in many regions. So since sea level will continue to rise past 2100, because the oceans take a very long time to respond to warmer conditions at the Earth's surface, we can expect that ocean waters will therefore continue to warm, and sea level will continue to rise for many centuries at a rate higher or equivalent to than those of the current century. The intensity and frequency of duration of North Atlantic hurricanes, as well as the frequency of like Category 4 to as high as Category 5 hurricanes, have all increased since the early 1980s. This is when our cognizance at a policy level of climate change really began in its early infancy. And with this regards, the relative contributions of human and natural causes to these increases were at the time still uncertain, but we're a lot more cognizant of what they are now. So when we consider this, we have to bear in mind the social and political consequences. So with this regards, we must talk about disruptions to food supply due to drought and famine, unprecedented refugee crises due to drought in newly uninhabitable regions of the earth. This is a projection particularly pertaining to Middle Eastern countries, given the desert and climate area of this region of the country. It could rise to such a degree that it is no longer habitable. This would be one of the largest refugee crises in history ever. And with it would come a rise in conflicts over necessary supplies like water, shelter, and food. So under normal conditions, the globalization of markets and access to humanitarian relief and public health systems all tend to reduce the susceptibility of countries and their populations to local climate risks. However, because the prices of basic commodities, as would be occurring under drought and famine that would correlate with climate change, These are often subsidized, but demonstrations and even riots could frequently occur in response to efforts by governments to reduce subsidies as these resources become even more sparse. So in essence, we'd be seeing more conflict due to necessities of life, water, shelter, and food. And then also new forms of imperialism. So what this would generally mean is the imposition of accountability and with regards to climate change reform on underdeveloped and developing countries, largely not responsible for climate change by imperialist nations that have the largest carbon emissions and whose multinational corporations that granted do take some flight into underdeveloping and developed countries mainly to exploit labor there. They would also generally not have any accountability there. These developed countries that largely have the capital that has been directly responsible for climate change. And with it would come health crises as well. More disease exposure, many new diseases and viruses that have been found in the melting of the ice caps could lead to new health crises similar to COVID-19, but these sort of circumstances would become more frequent. So I want to contextualize that with like a fictional case, a science fiction case. If any of you have ever seen Snowpiercer, it's an excellent film. It portrays the fallout of society and mankind at large following an under-scrutinized geoengineering tactic that was utilized to counter climate change. This was originally a French graphic novel, I believe, but it was directed by the same director who made Parasite. The planet becomes engulfed in snow at uninhabitable low temperatures, and humanity is doomed to class warfare on board a train that circles the globe 24/7. Now, of course, this is the science fiction case, and if you're not familiar with this film, you may have seen Hated in the Nation from Black Mirror, which discusses bots kind of replacing the extinction of bumblebees that are necessary to maintaining global agriculture. Or you may have seen Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, if that's the closest one, which kind of toys with the concept of altering weather and how this could be detrimental. Granted, that's a children's film, but nonetheless, similar concept. So how likely are any of these scenarios? It's probably not going to start raining food anytime soon, but these concepts, even though they originate in science fiction, they aren't as far off, even if they tend to be exacerbating elements of apocalypse a lot more than perhaps the real world would. So with that, what is geoengineering, this concept that I defined in these science fiction examples? Defined by the Oxford Geoengineering program, geoengineering is the deliberate large-scale intervention in the Earth's natural systems to counteract climate change. So I kind of want to open up into the science of what this would generally look like, because when we talk about this, and I chose this image of a globe or a sphere, because it can be very interesting and meticulous to devise what these technologies would look like. How would they be implemented? And so before we go into the ethical discussion of what the ramifications of this technology could mean, I think some summarization of what this technology would look like would be beneficial. So, but before we get into that, just generally what the history of geoengineering research would lead you to believe about this technology. So David Keith is a leading scientist and researcher at Harvard University in carbon engineering. He's been one of the leading scientific minds on the front of climate engineering and has helped support peers and colleagues of his in fostering programs at these top universities such as Oxford, I believe, and as well as Harvard. I know that for sure. With regards to carbon engineering, climate engineering, anything in the realm of technologically combating the effects of climate change. So a lot of this research arose in the early 2000s and to much scrutiny and skepticism because, which in my personal belief, I believe was warranted at the time because a lot of this technology is still very much rooted in the hypothetical, and much of this technology still does not exist to this day. So considering how much of a technological leap we've made since then, it's understandably viewed as more of an option than it is perhaps in the early 2000s when we were not yet quite as technologically advanced. We've accelerated our technological progression, especially with the age of the internet. So with types of geoengineering that have given rise from this research in the past, we will discuss kind of the models that have been tested in these research methods by scientists like David Keith. And they mainly come into three different categories. So solar geoengineering, carbon dioxide removal, and weather modification or earth radiation management. So I'm going to open up with solar radiation management or solar geoengineering. So generally what this would look like is any sort of method that addresses UV rays or light coming from the sun and actively generally try to bounce it back. So some examples include, and this is one is the most popular, stratospheric aerosol injection, high albedo crops, and snow forest clearance, as well as microbubbles. But for the sake of time, I will go into a semi-in-depth discussion of stratospheric aerosol injection, but may summarize a bit more toward the end with regards to the last three. So stratospheric aerosol injection, it generally proposes to spray large quantities of sulfur particles, such as sulfur dioxide, into the stratosphere, which is the upper layer of the atmosphere where much of this accumulation would occur. Proposals range from shooting particles from artillery guns or using large hoses to the sky or emptying particles from the back of aircraft. In more precise scientific language, this has been summarized as the deployment of several dozens up to several hundreds throughout the years as this technology becomes progressively more tested and perhaps more reliable of release of sulfurs. So you would use things like drones, aeroplanes, things like that. The more nuanced this technology and perhaps reliable it became. High albedo crops are generally best summarized as the various proposals that suggest that growing crops that reflect more light, either new crops or high albedo varieties of existing crops. This could be in synthesis with genetically modified organisms or GMOs. It could cool the atmosphere, reflecting more solar radiation back into space. Snow forest clearance is also the suggesting of clearing forests that exist in snow in areas that are snow covered for a large part of the year, increasing the amount of light reflected back into space by the flatter and brighter snow. The albedo is the ability for the light capacity in a natural element or something occurring on Earth to reflect back from light. So things like concrete or pavement, they generally retain more heat. So when you step on it, it's going to burn your feet. But unlike snow, it's very cold, though it has less to do with temperature. The brightness element does allow it to reflect back more sunlight, and it has an albedo rate of, I believe, 90% of all sunlight that reflects onto it reflects back. Microbubbles generally are best described as like this proposal that suggests by generating millions of tiny air bubbles in the ocean, large areas could be made to reflect more sunlight back into space. So furthermore, going in from this, carbon dioxide removal. Much of this technology still is very hypothetical, but to synthesize all of them together is generally the proposal, so hence these three different categories. So enhanced weathering is generally described as magnifying certain effects with regards to dissolving crushed minerals, so particularly silicate minerals, on land or in the sea in order to react with and fix atmospheric carbon dioxide into oceans and soils. Biochar techniques generally identify pre-existing farming techniques, similar to like slash and burn, but less so. It's more about burning biomass and municipal waste in the absence of oxygen to create charcoal. This charcoal is then mixed into soils as a soil additive, directly burying carbon into the soil. The approach is inspired by some Black soils where indigenous communities have used charcoals to improve fertility. So utilizing more techniques that are used by indigenous communities, as well as bioenergy with carbon capture. So what this would generally look like is capturing CO2 or carbon dioxide from bioenergy applications, like ethanol production or burning biomass for electricity, and subsequently sequestering that CO2 through either carbon capture and storage or carbon capture CCUS, which is a similar concept to carbon capture and storage. The theory behind this is that BECCS is carbon negative because bioenergy is theoretically carbon neutral as well. The carbon that has been emitted based on this idea, plants will regrow to fix. And many critics suggest that this overlooks emissions from land use change and life cycle emissions, but this can be incorporated, some have argued. And furthermore, into weather modification and earth radiation management, our last category, will open with ocean fertilization. Now, this actually has been tested in some technology. It's still in its infancy, as I mentioned. This would be one of them. So ocean fertilization refers to the dumping of iron, such as powdered iron sulfate or other nutrients into the ocean in areas with low biological productivity in order to stimulate phytoplankton growth. in theory, the resulting phytoplankton draw down atmospheric CO2 and then die, falling to the ocean bed and sequestering carbon. Cirrus cloud thinning. Generally, this would be a similar concept to, I believe, sulfate injection through aerosols, but a different deployment method. So just kind of to summarize, what can we expect from this technology? Now, as I've said before, much of this technology has only been tested in its model format. However, a lot of the results from this research has been relatively promising, with transparency on the part of the scientists spearheading this initiative. They do generally express some skepticism as to the ways in which this technology would be employed, and recognize that with any alteration or as a concept has gone, playing God with the environment, there has been some warranted concern. So we don't necessarily know what active employment at a mass scale of this technology would look like, but as I've said, with the technology acceleration of the past 20 years, more people, including I believe the Bill Gates Foundation, have looked toward funding initiatives that concentrate on geoengineering, given that we may not meet our carbon neutral reduction goals by 2030, or within the 7 to 12 years, as the climate clock recently put up in New York City would always also suggest. So some ethical concerns. You could call this a general breakdown of what strategies or hypothetical what ifs could happen should this technology be implemented. Some bad side effects. So one is the replacement for cutting carbon emissions. Leading researchers in carbon and climate engineering have been vocally wary of the interests of fossil fuel lobbyists investing in geoengineering as an alternative to cutting carbon emissions. So with regards to this, if this were to be a contentious issue, particularly in a similar light, which we can look toward historically, would be the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. If that was considered a very contentious issue, this certainly would be as well as some concern to conspiratorial thought regarding chemtrails, quite famously. It would sow some distrust on the part of people within perhaps rural America and the United States and other parts of North America generally. So this could not supplant cutting carbon emissions. Most scientists who have been semi-favorable of geoengineering technologies have stressed the importance of implementing geoengineering in conjunction with cutting carbon emissions, and that this pairing could be vital to truly meeting our carbon reduction goals. Historically, one example we can look to is the research of, I forget his name, but carbon chlorofluorocarbons, which was released in aerosol cans in the 1970s and 80s, and was leading to the endangerment of key eagle species in North America, but also holes in the ozone layer. And with adequate reform and just a simple change in lifestyle with regard to what aerosols and better regulation of chemical industries, we were able to counter this in a way that was effective and even repair the hole that was in the ozone layer for the most part, though this will last a long time in order to properly repair, provided that we don't retract some of our research and policies that we've done to address CFCs. But what makes geoengineering and climate engineering very different from CFCs of the past, of the 1970s and 80s, is that this is a larger scale, more enveloping issue that pertains to policies with regards to the relationship with fossil fuel lobbying, as well as investment and or divestment. So this has been a primary concern, an ethical concern of leading scientists in this field. Another one is a lack of pre-existing technology. So some have suggested that this could be disastrous in practice, simply because even though it has been promising in the models that have been developed and some of the small scale technology that has been implemented, it would not be adequate enough, or it would have disastrous consequences like that which we see in the movie Snowpiercer, though possibly and hopefully to a lesser degree. Some have cited damage to crop production. So one example is there's a monsoon that comes through cyclically through, I want to say, the southern and western hemisphere that is necessary and imperative to agricultural crop cycles. And if this were to actively disrupt that, it could damage the agricultural food supply throughout the entire world, but particularly the global south. Some have cited that detachment from fluctuations in sunlight has been a blind side of been blindsided in the studies of particularly solar geoengineering. So they do not account for fluctuations in sunlight. Exacerbation of climate change should geoengineering halt suddenly. So as I mentioned before, should the contention of climate change policy become such a contentious issue that we were to reverse geoengineering, especially on the part of a voting populace that would be skeptical of such technology, it could actually amplify the effects of climate change. So if you were to suddenly retract solar geoengineering technology, it could potentially double with negative reaction to the sulfates that have been injected into the stratosphere. Alongside this, there could be a potential dramatic increase in acid rain, the downfall of sulfuric acid on communities from atmospheric changes, again relating to a sulfuric aerosol injection through technologies of solar geoengineering. So one issue that I want to touch on really quickly, just at a conceptual level, is the concept of climate gentrification, geopolitical arms race, and a new form of imperialism. So climate gentrification is currently an ongoing issue. And this would manifest itself not terribly differently, but it would have a new added dynamic should geoengineering technologies be implemented. Climate gentrification is best defined as the gentrification or the higher prices in formerly lower income or high ethnic minority communities who are being pushed out or displaced by the increase in property taxes in areas. Now, what climate change would bring to this is a new added dimension of gentrification, as though it's not already an incredibly complex and at times very sad issue. Climate change, we could see this in the example of some coastal cities in South Texas, particularly in the Houston area, where low-income communities that happen to live in these low-income neighborhoods that are safer or more farther inland from the coastal regions or from the Gulf Coast, in the example of South Texas, would be pushed out as higher property taxes would be brought in by a new gentrifying community seeking to avoid the rising sea levels and risk of hurricane. So a similar concept with this in conjunction, no matter what geoengineering technologies we would implement, this does not necessarily address, though not necessarily some would suggest it is equipped to address the issue of climate gentrification. But this is a policy issue that would have to be considered in conjunction with this. Some have suggested a geopolitical arms race. This would, the technology of geoengineering and weather modification, which has so often been a highly scientifically fictional concept, would become a real threat to the stability of other nations and other countries, particularly those of the global south or those that superpowers consider enemies with each other, because it would directly be a more, not necessarily stagnant, but less obvious form of, some would argue, genocide. If you could directly deny through political means the ability for land to harvest fruits and vegetables and the agriculture they need to just sustain their basic necessities that have now become a new scarcity, some would argue, even though at the same time some would argue we're entering post-scarcity. These simultaneously coexisting concepts could endanger some of the most marginalized communities who are suffering the most from climate change. And so new imperialism or new methods of imposing could include putting a lot of the accountability of climate change on these underdeveloped and developing countries. This has been a concern of scientists with regards to the demographic transition, excuse me, of these underdeveloped and developing countries. As these countries and nations have grown in population, some have feared that the imposition of climate change policies would shift a lot of the accountability from corporations in North America that are largely responsible for carbon emissions. So what would comprehensive climate change reform look like? Now, this is a highly complex topic that we're dealing with, so just a brief summation of what some of these potential goals could or should perhaps look like. So in the ideal situation, using the estimated climate clock as a framework for what actionable steps can be taken to counteract and reduce climate change, within about 7 to 12 years, we would need to be able to accomplish the following. We would need to have almost international consensus, including major world powers like the United States, to commit to carbon reduction initiatives like the Paris Climate Accords, compatible with halting an increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030 at the latest. We would need potentially a complete move to renewable energy by all nations within 7 to 12 years, and an unprecedented prioritization of carbon capture and storage, as well as reforestation. Now, this is the ideal situation, but with this in mind, what would geoengineering's role in this be? Is there genuine concern or cause for skepticism with regards to the real utility that this technology could have? But because so much of it is untested, we are unaware of the geopolitical implications that this technology could potentially have. Do the potential benefits outweigh the dangers? So if you wouldn't mind, Ben, I'd like to open this to just a brief discussion if y'all would like.
Yeah, I have no problem with that. If anyone wants to chime in on what should geoengineering's role be, do the potential benefits outweigh the dangers, or if anyone has any other questions that you would like me to ask Jessica, now is the time for you to pop those in the chat, or you can unmute your mics and join us if you'd like. As people kind of think about that, Jessica, like, you used a term in your talk, post-scarcity. Could you explain what that is real quickly?
That's a good question. So post-scarcity has to do with the concept that our technology and capacity to keep up basic necessities is something that we have long since or recently accomplished. But with regards to how this would pertain to this concept, it would have to do with the concept of the distribution or potentially the redistribution of these resources. So we have the technology and the means, even within a society that has accommodated for climate change technologically, to accommodate for the basic necessities of every person on this planet. But as I discussed in my previous sustainability talk on the right of housing, a perfect example is that there are 500,000 homeless people in the United States alone, but there are 1.5 million vacant homes. So not only is there not necessarily a crisis of homelessness per se, it is something that we can address, but are we choosing to? And that's a debated and a rather contentious topic. So with the regards to post-scarcity, are we distributing these resources that we can make quite easily in this new technological era to those that also need it as a basic human right? Some would argue not. I would argue not as well. So yeah.
So basically, kind of like what you're saying in terms of post-scarcity is we have the resources, we have the ability to take care of people in terms of food or whatever it is. It's a distribution of where is all that food going. So we have enough food. It's just that not everyone's getting that food.
Yes, and this is also in regards to what issues we choose or choose not to address. Something that has been cited in the past is that food waste is one of the most frivolous issues that the United States is facing, because these are things that are relatively easy to combat when we consider, in food chains and in restaurants, how much food goes to waste, or even in personal households. How much of our food that is perfectly fine or can be perfectly used just ends up being thrown away. We do have the accommodations that we can make to ensure that this food that is perfectly good does not get wasted, but it's just not something we have addressed. So much of this issue is about choosing to reframe the paradigm in which these issues supposedly occur, but we also have to reframe who we hold accountable for them as well. And I think this is true at a geopolitical and international level.
Yeah, okay, great. All right, so like what do you think is you did this research on geoengineering, like what do you think is the future of geoengineering? And is there any like projects or research, like big projects research that's underway currently that you think we should be aware of?
So I think geoengineering, from what I've read, and I found that there was a lot of very warranted skepticism from the scientists who are actively pursuing research in geoengineering, who are concerned about the political implications. However, I do think that this technology could be incredibly promising. I think arguably it would be remarkably reliable because we're having an exponential increase in how much research is going into geoengineering. The only concern would be, which I don't believe would be likely, is that we would demand like an acceleration or an output for new climate change measures, such as a sulfur injection into the atmosphere. In a way or in an urgency that scientists don't feel that we are ready for. Now, because we don't tend to prioritize climate change in our policy, I don't believe this would happen. I don't believe that the public policy agenda would quickly reform to, oh my gosh, we need to address climate change right now, even though we are seeing unprecedented numbers of hurricanes as a result of climate change. I do have some skepticism that major corporations, particularly those originating in the Silicon Valley, would choose to prioritize geoengineering as a means to address the issue without holding themselves accountable. So that's mainly my concern, but I have personally, based on my research from this, some faith in those that are actively researching this topic.
So do you think that the technology that's being developed or that's being conceptualized, do you think it does actually have the potential to help us mitigate from climate change if utilized properly?
In my personal opinion, I think so. But again, it's something that would have to be pursued very, very cautiously. And the issue becomes of an over-dependence on geoengineering as a means to not hold accountable our own, frivolous carbon dependency that we are quickly needing to step away from. And we have been, but not at the rate that we need to in order to address impending climate change. One interesting thing that I've seen in researching this topic was the creation of synthetic fuels and which serve to substitute for pre-existing fuels, so we don't have to keep using new fuels every time, which is already a depleting source, fossil fuels. But we would use all the plastics in the ocean to potentially depend on that for our source of recycling fossil fuel, interestingly. Granted, it is still considered synthetic in nature, but it is nonetheless a very precise and very, albeit difficult, means of recycling plastic so that we would not have to keep depleting from fossil fuel. We would just use what is already present here now and is already being wasted into the ocean.
Okay, and then I do have a couple of questions in the chat. Do the aerosols stay in the stratosphere or can they eventually go back down to Earth? Is one question.
That's a great question. Some have expressed anxiety that they would eventually go back down to the Earth, some in the form of acid rain or sulfuric acid rain. And that is a possibility, but I believe they're still researching that topic in particular. The aerosols would not stay in the air for horribly long. That's why they would have to actively go back into the stratosphere and emit more sulfurs, gradually more and more as the years would go by. But it is a possibility that it could be implemented, but long-term, the aerosols don't stay as long as they would need to. So it would have to need frequent re-injection. Would geoengineering tie into the Green New Deal, and what specific technologies would be developed by engineers? So I don't believe, with my familiarity with the Green New Deal, that I've seen any specification of geoengineering, but I could see this being a, for those on the political side of the Green New Deal, some skepticism and especially wariness with regards to major corporations of those of the Silicon Valley and that would want to utilize geoengineering as a means to avoid, again, carbon emission reduction commitments. What specific technologies would be developed by engineers? So like I said, again, synthetic fuel, that's been a popular one that's originated in British Columbia. Well, not originated, but it's been heavily practiced and regenerated in the British Columbia area of Canada in particular. And a lot of the technological hypotheticals I presented that has been explored in this presentation would be those specific technologies that would be developed. And so you couldn't have one that you could afford to be over dependent on, like aerosol injection, even though that's a very popular one. You would need a combination of all, some would argue.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Jessica. We're like about 10 minutes over time here, so and that looks like all the questions we have in the chat. So thank you for this really interesting talk. I definitely learned a lot. You can see here, Jessica has her sources here on the screen. And I'm sure if you're interested in getting some of those sources, she could send those to you. And I don't know if you wanted to plug your last slide here, Jessica.
Sure,
You wanted
yeah.
to say something real quick here before I just went on. I'm going to share my screen here in a second.
Sure, yeah. I'll just have one closing statement and then I'll have a call to vote real quick. So you can vote in Brazos County. It is an election season, of course, as I'm sure we're all familiar with. So here are the locations for in-person voting in Brazos County. I recommend go early if you can, because the lines do get really long. Memorial Student Center has room 526. If you've been on campus recently, you can see that there are line markings out the door. So if there are no people, you can just follow those line markings and find generally where the room is. They've kept that door open so that people can go in. The College Station Utilities Meeting and Training Facility, Galilee Baptist Church in Bryan, Arena Hall, and the Brazos County Administration Building. So I just have one more closing thought. It's a wall of text, so let me read it for you. Just kind of a general closing statement. So when we consider the implications climate change will have on our life, climate change as an issue psychologically does not resonate with a desensitized and first world populace. Even when we acknowledge the dire circumstances of climate change, it's difficult for those of us to conceive of a world in which the geopolitical world begins to deconstruct its facade of accountability and supposed spearheading of progress global superpowers have presented themselves as doing. Deconstruction, not necessarily even in a meaningful way, of addressing hierarchies of political exploitation that perpetuate world hunger, poverty, and labor exploitation, but that which imposes all these responsibilities onto those least responsible for the issues, on top of already bearing the brunt of its impacts, animals, children, and the global South at large in particular. In this climate change era, we are already in and are accelerating deeper into labor rights, national and continental borders, and systemic discrimination all becoming the same issue unified by climate change. So when we consider geoengineering, I believe we must foremost acknowledge and be wary of how this technology can feed into sort of cannibalizing view of technology and human interest. So that's my last closing statement. So do go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jessica. It's a great way to conclude things. Some really good food for thought there. And I think what Jessica just said was to me the part that was the most powerful was the fact that those that are facing the brunt of these issues and challenges and being faced to really having to really face this stuff head on are not the ones that are causing these problems. So we all have a really great responsibility in our own actions and holding corporations and others accountable. And you can see here Jessica has how important it is to vote. So really kind of think about others and think about the environment and how other people are impacted when you cast your vote and what's going to help those people out the most. So I think that was a really good point and strong way to end it. So thank you for that, Jessica. And now I'm just going to stop sharing her screen. I'm going to share my screen real quickly and we'll get y'all out of here. So I just wanted to point out that later today, actually, in just 18 minutes, we have our next talk. So Kendall is going to talk to us about endangered species and how those may or may not be impacted by COVID-19. So that's a really neat topic. So please tune in. And then we have a little bit of a break over Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, because on Wednesday, we're going to have an Instagram event. So rather than having stuff all over on these Zoom talks, we're going to do something on Instagram. We have a whole lot of campus partners, and they're going to have a chance to tell you what they're doing to be sustainable. So please check that out. You can share our posts, you can like our posts, you can even save the posts and comment on them, and that's a great way for us to get more widespread knowledge. Letting people know what's happening on campus to be sustainable. And then on Friday of this week, we're going to come back with a couple of presentations. One of them is at 1 p.m. on Friday. It's about fast fashion, so maybe something that a lot of y'all are interested in. And then that's by Jenny. And then at 5 p.m. on that same Friday, Paige is going to talk to us about the sustainability of disturbances. So that's something that I haven't learned much about myself, so I'm really interested in that presentation. So please come join us in about 15 minutes. Kendall's going to talk to us about endangered species and COVID. So please check us out. And otherwise, hope you all have a good rest of your week. And hopefully we'll either see you later today or we'll see you on Friday. And check out our Instagram, remember, on Wednesday, Instagram and Facebook. So y'all take care and stay safe.